Greetings from Denver, Colorado, and happy Cinco de Mayo. My name is David White. I'm a partner with Pinnacle based out of the Denver office, and we were vying for the 4 p.m. spot where we could serve margaritas, but have the earlier spot. But I've been told by Joel and Clay that it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Next slide, please. So as we were planning the slides, we were thinking about drinks and food. 3 fun facts of Cinco de Mayo I found and thought I'd share with the group before we dive into the presentation. First of all, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexico's Independence Day. It results from a war, Franco-Mexican War in 1862. And the second fact is that FDR helped commercialize Cinco de Mayo in 1933. And the last fact, I'm a foodie and we need something to go with our margarita. So the other fun fact is that 80 million pounds of avocados are consumed on Cinco de Mayo. Who knew? So anyway, now that we've got a virtual drink and a little bit of appetizer, I wanted to get into the discussion. The topics that we'll be talking about today help to facilitate a practical conversation about physician compensation plan design and compliance support. The topics that we'll be covering include physician alignment and compensation plan design. We'll be talking about that. Clay will be addressing fair market value, specifically taking data to information. And Joel will be talking about establishing organizational process, standards, and efficiency in kind of a real world environment. Next slide. So why is physician compensation so important? I think, it becomes the keystone of healthcare services. It impacts the quality, the outcome, the capabilities, the coordination, all of the things that a health system or healthcare organization need to assemble. It reminds me of a story about the most important piece of equipment in healthcare. I was talking with a physician friend of mine a long time ago. He goes, Dave, what is the most expensive piece of equipment in healthcare? And I was thinking, man, it's got to be a proton machine or an expensive Tesla MRI, something like that. He goes, no, Dave, you're missing the boat. It's the pen of the physician. And the more I started thinking about it, it's so true. The physician relationship drives so much of what happens in a community with healthcare, that the relationship and creating alignment with the community physicians becomes instrumental in terms of planning. At the highest level, the planning should be in line with the mission, the vision, and the values of the sponsoring organization. When we're talking about sponsoring organizations, I think it's important to recognize that those could be hospitals, ACOs, multi-specialty medical groups, long-term care providers, dialysis companies, home health DME. It could even be health plans in the community that have the relationship with the physicians. The capabilities and the resources of the organization, understanding kind of the external environment and other intangibles should be really strong inputs to organizing thoughts around the physician compensation plan. These might include clinical capabilities that currently exist or may exist in the future, leadership and the capabilities of the leadership team, changes in the demographics, the community need, what's happening with the growth. We're seeing so much take place right now with COVID and the ability to work remote. There are communities throughout the country that are expanding at exponential paces, and those new populations will be looking for enhanced, more robust healthcare services. And what's happening with competition and health plans in a market also become important. So, understanding the planning of your environment becomes a big part. Follow up to that is, what are the objectives of the plan that you're creating with the doctors? We've identified a couple of talking points that we weave into our planning documents, our policy and procedure documents, and just a couple that might include a starting place for alignment. Begin with compliance. So specifically, is the plan and is the calculations defensible from a fair market value perspective? The second is consistent. Does the plan create a foundation based on common principles and precedents applied to present and future arrangements? Is the plan competitive? In terms of recruitment and retention dynamics, is it reflective of the market? Is the plan adaptive? Becomes another important objective. Does the plan provide flexibility for physician practice preferences and industry changes? Is the plan responsive? And by responsive, we mean, does it help accelerate the decision making? And last but not least, and I'm sure there's others to add to the list, but transparency. And this might be the most important after compliance is it easy to explain and discuss with the physician community, the management team, and the legal counsel? So next slide, please. So there are entire presentations with AHLA and ABA and other organizations around regulatory and compliance environment. It's known and often talked about all the different settlements, but the largest hospital settlements and related to government fraud and abuse focus is on the hospital and the physician financial relationships. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to lead towards sustainability and profitability and avoid wearing orange or being in federal prison, as the cartoon suggests. Certainly the key legal considerations that are talked about in those presentations are Stark Law, anti-kickback statute. Those are the two that come to most people's top of mind. Others, though, that are very important considerations, especially for not-for-profit entities, are the IRS rules for tax-exempt organizations and civil monetary penalties, especially with organizations that are pursuing risk-based arrangement, value-based purchasing, quality incentives, capitated arrangement. Civil monetary penalties specifically related to stinting of care become an important topic to think about in your plan design. Next slide, please. So, the sign says it all, change is ahead. What we find interesting with planning compensation design is that there's oftentimes three plans that need to be considered. The plan that you had, the plan that you have that you're living under currently, and the plan that you may design in the future. What we find is that physician compensation plans are continually evolving and need to be responsive to the marketplace. Whether it's a new physician recruit or an experienced medical staff leader, compensation arrangements should match the expectations of the organization with the contribution, duties, and responsibilities of the physician. That should be an underlying principle. Having clarity and communication on the expectations will help attract and retain physician team members. We're also advocates of thinking about how quality, outcomes, citizenship, and non-physician collaboration can factor into a compensation plan, and that shared accountability and administrative simplicity are also important considerations. Next slide. So what do we see as arrangements with physicians defining the relationships? And it can be broad. These represent an example of the type of arrangements that we see. They can be mutually exclusive or can be combined into a representative contract. Employment agreements for services, professional services agreements that can be more than just the clinical work. It can encompass other factors of a physician practice entity. Medical directorships, coverage agreements are becoming more prevalent. We're seeing that take shape as certain areas in the country are having challenge with a 1 in 3 or a 1 in 4 rotation. So conversations about disproportionate call, and especially with EMTALA arrangements and level 1, level 2 trauma requirements, coverage agreements are becoming very much front and center. Another agreement that we're seeing a lot of activity and traction on is clinical co-management, where we're seeing physicians take on more responsibility, more accountability, more oversight, more participation, in some ways like a medical directorship on steroids. And, you know, we see that typically with specialties like neurosurgery, orthopedics, cardiovascular, GI, general surgery, independent contractor agreements, teaching and faculty agreements and arrangements, shared use and cost arrangements, leasing agreements of shared space, management services agreements where there are capabilities within a physician practice that an entity wants to take and use rather than duplicating that capability. And others that come to mind are research, clinically integrated networks, IPAs, membership agreements with ACOs. So really any relationship, I mean, it's a blanket statement, but any relationship that a sponsoring organization has with a physician in the community can be defined as fair market value and have an arrangement that falls into a compensation plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of the planning process, we found that to try to keep it as simple as possible, not to make it difficult. Some of the questions that we've outlined in the following pages start to think about expectations, behavior, and process. And so some of the key questions that we might suggest be considered when thinking through a physician plan include, you know, at a high level, what are the services that are being requested? Clinical, administrative, research, teaching, supervision, call coverage, et cetera. What type of behavior is the plan trying to create? Is it management in nature? Is it clinical in nature? Is it productivity driven? Is it outreach? So really thinking about the alignment with the physicians. Does the arrangement have a complete job description that identifies the payments and the services received? How is the payer environment influencing the decisions? Is it a fee-for-service community? Is it moving to a per member per month arrangement, a capitated arrangement, more value-based contracting? If the contract is productivity-based, one specific question that we deal with a lot is, are the services that are not tracked by CPT code, how are they being recognized to reflect contribution by the physician and compensated for? How is the organization aligning with value-based purchasing and or outcomes? Is it a holdback? Is it a bonus? Does it create more upside for the physician in the contract? How did the pandemic change the way the hospital thinks about contracting with its doctors? Becomes an important consideration, both with recruitment and retention. Last but not least, are the physicians burning out? There seems to be a lot being spoken about this topic lately, and how does the hospital's culture respond to these pressure points through their compensation plan design? Next slide, please. So programmatic next steps, you know, just things to consider that start to transition to Clay and Joel. How will the organization document fair market value? What are the processes? Who are the people? How does it become efficient, consistent, and compliant? Does the benchmark data from the published sources, does it represent the hospital's environment? Something to think about. Is the physician's scope of practice being fully appreciated or accounted for? So things that we might think about in this context would be, you know, an internal medicine physician doing endoscopy, or a family practice physician delivering babies, or a general surgeon that's doing ERCPs for a hospital. And so in developing the compensation plan design, does that scope of practice, how is that accounted for, and how does that impact the arrangement between the parties? Is the benchmark data adequate, or does the organization need support, you know, from a third party? You know, here I guess there's two parts to it. Is the published compensation representing, you know, the needs to advance recruitment and retention, and also does there need to be a focused report from a third party to support the arrangement? And, you know, we've talked a lot about fair market value, and we will talk a lot more about fair market value, but, you know, the other side of the ledger on this is how is the organization assessing and who is documenting commercial reasonableness? So if you think about fair market value, it's how much. If you think about commercial reasonableness, it's why. And, you know, kind of the thought behind the process is broader stakeholder participation. We think about the process being coordinated with legal counsel and at a high level reflect the circumstances of the arrangement from a practical standpoint. So next slides. So a couple of transitional thoughts before handing things over to Clay. You know, the regulatory support should be developed in parallel to the compensation plan design. So kind of thinking with the end in mind, putting those puzzle pieces together. And that consistent and compliant support can help support and enhance the planning process, and that physician compensation planning is going to be instrumental and, you know, highly related to both the short-term and long-term success of an organization. So with that in mind, Clay.
Thanks, Dave. I was thinking about having some fun Cinco de Mayo facts, but I guess I'm glad I didn't look up any because you took care of that. So, you know, practically speaking, how does a healthcare organization go about developing and maintaining compliant and competitive payment arrangements that are consistent with fair market value and commercial reasonable standards without having to resort to calling Pinnacle or another consultant for every agreement? Excuse me. One solution Pinnacle offers to its hospital and health system clients is its F&B consulting guide. It seems like it was just yesterday, but it's been about 10 to 15 years now, where a client came to us and he's like, you know, or I think it's a CEO of one of our longstanding clients, came to us and was like, you know, I really like talking to you guys. You're great and all, it's fun, but I don't like having to pay for it. It's kind of like that whole fraternity thing. You buy your friends. He's like, I need a resource that I can have in-house that allows us to handle, you know, the lower risk agreements on our own without having to, you know, pick up the phone and call Pinnacle. And then from that conversation, and several similar conversations along those lines, Pinnacle's FB Consulting Guide was born. You know, through the guide, we're basically taking data to information. It utilizes published compensation data, translates that data to usable information for our clients to internally document F&V based on an unbiased third party's guidance. The elements within the guide include data on compensation elements for a multitude of payment arrangements. As Dave covered, there's, you know, you can be paying for everything that's called. There's medical directorships, clinical responsibilities, other administrative roles. And you know, recognizing that within our guide, we include, you know, data on all those points for, you know, over 100 different specialties. And of course, what's the benefit of this sort of process? And, you know, there's a lot of other resources out there as well, but really this sort of process provides resources for a user to save time, save money, develop their own internal resources, all the while being able to enhance and promote their compliance when contracting with physicians and advanced practice providers. So what data underlies our guide? Like many valuation firms, we're using the published compensation surveys to support our consulting work. Consistent with regular guidance, we incorporate multiple surveys, develop FMV opinions both in our focus work and within the guide. Our approach in developing the guide's information and ranges of value, which are premised on the 25th through 75th percentiles, you know, based on our proprietary methods and developed consistently with SARC and anti-kickback statute guidance. Through this process, we're able to provide F&V opinions and market perspectives to clients on the vast majority of their different compensation arrangements. It's not going to cover everything, but you know, for the most part, our target is those, you know, low to moderate risk arrangements where you don't need to get the outside consultant in there to value, but you need something for the file. So again, what elements do we report? You know, using the published data, we're able to provide perspective on, you know, the typical employed clinical services, medical director payments on an hourly basis, clinical hourly payments on an hourly basis with both employed and independent physicians, call arrangements, compensation per work RVU, and then the whole gamut of productivity-related metrics such as collections, annual work RVUs, compensation to collection ratios, and the all-important comp to work RVU ratio. And as I mentioned, we premise our ranges on the 25th to 75th percentiles, allowing the user a lot of flexibility as they want to set their compensation plan or individual arrangement for over the 100 specialties, from internal medicine to general surgery, and then all the way down to audiology or nurse practitioner and PAs. So, the benefit is there's a lot of compensation arrangements out there. We're not trying to support the neurosurgeon making $2 million producing work RVUs at the 90th percentile or 50% above the 90th percentile, but there are a lot of those, I guess, low-hanging fruit that if the user's following the appropriate process, a hospital can support their arrangements to be compliant and accurately reflect the market using our guide or a similar tool to support the majority of their contracts. So, what are the benefits? I think, or we believe that, you utilize the guide to its full effect, the benefits are tremendous. Of course, there's no more valuable resource than time. And our hospitals are often engaged in fast-paced negotiations, as all of you watching the presentation, I'm sure that's just how it is. People want answers. People want answers now. When you're talking about money with a physician, that's, it's like, I need that answer yesterday. So I think the primary benefit is just allowing the stakeholders the flexibility to give that answer. Okay, I have the resource here. I am able to give the endocrinologist or whatever specialty is, here's what we're thinking, without having to pick up the phone, call whoever, Pinnacle or the other evaluation company. And second to time, obviously, financial resources loom large. It's not practical to engage a third party for most of the organization's compensation arrangements. So our goal is, through the guide, is to support the client's bottom line, so they're not having to fork over the robust hourly rate that I charge for my services. Thirdly, the guide allows the organization to have the resources within as I kind of touched on, but that allows the money saving, the time saving. You're able to quickly access what you need to set up your compensation plan or contract with the nurse practitioner, or that these people haven't had a raise for a while, so they're at X dollar per hour, or they're making this much money per year. Do we have some flexibility to bump that up about 15% or whatever the parties are thinking? And at the end of the day, really what we're trying to do is provide that that compliance support for what the organization is trying to do. And through the Pinnacle consulting guide, you can sleep better at night. You know that your rheumatologist is not making too much money, or your internal medicine doc is paid market for his or her contribution. So, and with that said, I'd like to hand off to Joel for some real world consideration and practical application of physician compensation issues.
Thanks, Clay. I appreciate it. And Dave, just so you know, I'm salting my rim as we speak right now. And happy Cinco de Mayo to everyone else out there that's listening to this. So appreciate the opportunity to do this. I just wanted to give you a little background of where I'm coming from. I'm the director of finance, which oversees all of our physician compensation arrangement at our organization. We're centrally located. If you think of California as a kind of a big twisted banana, we're centrally located in the center of the state, a big agricultural community. And we also are home of the major trauma center in the center of our state. So we stay pretty busy. Our emergency department at our trauma hospital is the busiest in the state, and if not the busiest nationally. We see a lot of patients in our trauma center, believe it or not. Amongst our trauma center, we have another non-trauma hospital that sits about 15 miles east of our main trauma hospital. We also have a heart and surgical hospital that is very highly recognized for its bariatric program. and a multitude of other heart and surgical processes it does. Recently, about a year and a half ago, we've also opened up our cancer center that's very near and dear to our hearts and our community that it serves. In addition to that, we also have an acute psychiatric center that's also part of our hospital system. And then in addition to that, we have a medical school that's attached to us through an affiliation with UCSF. So that kind of gives you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from. Our major other hospitals sit north and south from us in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as Los Angeles area for us. So we serve a vast community. We're a non-for-profit hospital. We serve a large basket full of underserved patients. To be honest with you, and I think we're about, if you look at our numbers across the board, about over 50% of the patients that we service are either Medi-Cal or uninsured. So we do have a pretty good stamp in that area. Next slide, please. So from where we come from, the biggest part of our fair market value program is key to this one, and that's the title of our slide, is developing a process. And we feel like we've done taken a pretty good stab at that. One of the biggest things we've done is looking at our processes. We've looked at the majority of what and who we have in our areas and what our expectations are. The biggest part of this is understanding what our processes are to begin with. And how do we do that? We actually have a policy that guides and directs our organizational physician compensation arrangements, from how we go through and how we grab or how we utilize the physician benchmark compensation data, whether we stick specifically to certain survey data or we go out and get specific market data. That seems to be one of our key indicators of value for our physicians that we hire. One other thing I want to mention also is in our area, and specifically in California, we independently contract with all of our physicians. And I'm going to speak a little bit later about how that's evolved and how that's changed. But right now we specifically enter into many agreements with them, and we'll speak to that also. The third bullet point on here is protecting your investment. We like that one as an organization because our physicians are our investment. They do a lot for us. Our patient care is key to us. The quality that our physicians bring to us is huge across the board for us. But one of the biggest things is when working in our organization and how we kind of utilize fair market value data and how we pass it along to other users in our organization. It kind of starts at the top. It starts with myself working with the operators, I guess, on the ground who's trying to hire the physicians for their role. And we're trying to put them kind of in the puzzle that they belong into. And so these other bullet points on here: train your staff, educate your physicians about fair market value, and work with counsel. All I can say on these is it's more and more true every day on how we do this and how we continue to develop our process. And I would say this about our process: it's an ongoing continuum, meaning that it's open and welcome to change as needed. And so we've kind of tweaked it along the ways, but we think we have a pretty good process now. We know when people in our organization know when to reach out to myself and getting physician compensation arrangements aligned with fair market value. And oftentimes we make determinations whether we do need to go out and get an independent opinion because that layers in key information for us and kind of lets us hone in on what we're paying for and the services that are being provided from the physicians that we hire. Next slide, please. Questions about when we utilize the physician consulting guide. So I would say this: the neatest thing about the physician consulting guide, which I've always referred to it as a culmination of a lot of survey data, which is what it is. One of the things I'd mentioned earlier that we do in our process, we have a policy that guides and directs what we do and the steps that we take through our physician compensation arrangements. And one of the biggest things that influences this is the multiple survey data source approach that we take. And the guide takes I think 5 or 6, sometimes in some cases 6 or 5 or 6 specific market data approaches to it, kind of averages those all together. But that's not the only answer to compensation for us. Oftentimes we have to go get specific data from other organizations, which gets into the focus reviews that we also will get on physician compensation arrangements for us. And then that becomes kind of our product that we use, and that kind of gets to the next thing. What or how is this compensation reasonable? Is 25th percentile reasonable? Are those barriers that we work between the 25th and 75th percentile, is that reasonable to pay doctors? And I think the first answer is yes, it's reasonable, but is that where we want to land? And do we want to make that decision to pay a doctor at the 75th percentile, or do we want to pay him at the 25th percentile? Always questions we have. And then there's the questions of, should we pay below the 25th percentile? And quite frankly, that does happen. And then the question is, do we pay above the 75th percentile? And I would say, yes, that does happen. Is it appropriate? It's kind of a whole other set of questions that we ask ourselves when we go through this whole process in compensating our physicians. And we have processes in place for if we pay below, if we pay between the 25th to 75th percentile, and if we pay above. And there are certain cases that happens. And so we like to keep our robust program kind of always moving, and it's quite frankly not a stagnant environment. There's always variables to consider. So I think that kind of helps out with, will the payments be commensurate with the expectations of the arrangement? Oftentimes in my world and in what we work with, there's a link to our legal counsel, which I think I'm on the phone or in a meeting with our legal counsel, one of our attorneys in our organization on a daily basis, and as well as the operators of the physician who are kind of overseeing the agreement that we're thinking about entering into. Because I think at the end of the day, when we have a fair market value, if I take the fair market value and I try to align it to the expectations that are outlined in the agreement, it doesn't. I think that doesn't pass the test of any regulator that would look at that. And so that's something that we make sure our organization to make sure that is paramount in ours, that our valuation does agree to the expectations of the physician, as well as the duties and responsibilities that are set forth in the agreement. And that kind of sets our risk tolerance, right? In certain areas, are we willing to go pay physicians for their services at the median, which is kind of what we as an organization try to do. That's kind of our casting area. That's where we'll try to sit on. Does it happen all the time? Yes and no. It does sometimes, and it doesn't some other times. And so, but it's kind of a way that we can kind of rotate from and decide how we want to move forward with our physician arrangements. Next slide, please. Moving on to understanding our components of our physician arrangements. One of the other big areas that we have in our physician compensation arrangements, and this to me is where the fun begins, right? When you get a fair market value, which a lot of data on, that we crunch through numbers and we try to figure out what we're doing. But this is where I think the fun begins, where you can take and you can ask yourself, okay, what are we paying for? What's in the arrangement? Are we just trying to compensate a medical director, which I think is probably the most easiest fair market value to do? Are we paying for clinical services? Are we paying for administrative roles? And I like this part about teaching, consulting, and quality, because more and more. Well, let me back up. We is because we have an academic organization that's attached to us through UCSF. We spend some time in the teaching area. Which is important for us. We have that teaching with our residents that carries through a few of our arrangements, and so that's important for us to make sure we capture appropriately. The consulting, yes, that's kind of an administrative role, but more and more importantly, are we seeing quality in our agreements? Quite frankly, compensating for quality is what physicians get paid for at a certain level, but it's also what we keep our physicians compensated for also. And thirdly on here is call coverage, but not only call coverage is a key one, but I like the one about call coverage, because there's always that, back in the days, physicians didn't get compensated for call, and more we're compensating them for call. And primarily I like this because you you get to have a one-on-one discussion with physicians and understand really what's their burden of call. And that's the biggest part about it. If you're just going to hire a physician to be in an unrestricted environment for call, we do that too, but oftentimes we have them in call arrangements where we're also trying to assess the burden for them, and that's one of the components that we also work through. That's a fun one also. So as we kind of get through the arrangements, we kind of understand the services and that kind of stuff. But one of the areas that we also that we're also aware of, that we also pay attention to is that we're not overcompensating or undercompensating for certain services. In other words, we have physicians in our organization, at least, and I'm sure many of you out there have physicians that have multiple agreements. And so we may have a medical director that's got administrative roles in one of their agreements, and another service agreement they've got them. So we try to make sure we're not kind of double paying them or stacking in compensation loads for arrangements that they're already being paid for. And so that's kind of a key metric that we watch for in our arrangements. The other part on here is, and I like this one, I almost wish that we would flash this one all the way through our slides, is match the terms and duties and responsibilities for what we're paying for. Everybody likes to know what they're getting paid for, and everybody likes to receive compensation for what they're getting paid for. And so this is a big one. In most arrangements, in ours at least, there's always that section that explains the duties, expectations, and responsibilities. And to me, I know when you give a doctor a contract to sign, oftentimes they turn to the page that says, when do I get paid? How much do I get paid? And what do I have to do to get paid? That what do I have to do to get paid is the most important part for me from the valuation side, because that's what we're valuing. And so that becomes kind of the bedrock of the arrangement and the background and support for the fair market value that we put together. Next slide, please. Practical considerations on the fair market value guide. And this is one reason I'm actually a big fan of the fair market value guide. One, it saves our organization time from grabbing an MGMA, a Sullivan-Cotter, an AMGA, and trying to consolidate the valuations or the survey data that goes into the valuation for us. And so I like this because it does a lot of that work for us. And then also it takes the beginning part of it takes the physician by specialty, which is one of the first things we do is when we're putting together a fair market value. If I've got an emergency medicine doctor, that's easy. I can go to the emergency medicine section. I can say emergency medicine docs based on multiple survey data. The annual compensation is this, the work RVUs is this, or the hourly compensation is this. It gives me a nice set of ranges that I can start with. And that, again, that's kind of the starting point of what we're going to do in the valuation. The next part is kind of what we talked about, the expectations of the arrangement. What are we paying for? And we go through that. And this is another fun area of my role, is because you get to not only put pen to paper on this, but you get to work with the physicians and also get their input on what their expectations are. Are we going to underburden them? Are we going to overburden them? Are we just looking for someone to look over and be a part of our medical director area? Are they going to be performing clinical services? Is it teaching and education? It's that kind of stuff that we look for. And so with some physicians, we have to look a little bit deeper. MGMA doesn't always have the answers. Sullivan-Cotter doesn't always have the answers. And it's always kind of a gut check when doctors will print out MGMA or Sullivan-Cotter and they'll bring it to you and they'll give you a response of, here's what I should get paid. Here's what they say in the survey data. Well, I like this. I like the other part on here, the market specific factors. Sometimes that specific physician, say rheumatology or physiatry. In our area, those are some of the challenging physicians specialties that we have to recruit. So that may drive the compensation a little bit. Recruiting and retaining them might be what's driving the compensation arrangement for us in the valuation. And so we may go get more market specific data from that and engage for a focused review in that area. Down here on the arrangement status, most of ours are independent contracted physicians with our organization that we pay for. We are starting to move towards a more employed area where we are employing them through our foundation model. So that's shifting a little bit for us, which we're enjoying as we go through. One of the last ones down here, the payer mix. That's always been a challenge for us in our hospital, primarily because we serve patients in an underserved area. And so our payer mix is not the most robust. It's a challenge for us, but it also, in a way, it keeps us honest to what we're paying physicians. Because quite honestly, in some areas, we can't pay top tier compensation for some of our physicians that we're hiring because the payer mix is a struggle for us. So it's a continuous thing that we work through. And again, down here on the last bullet point, physician provider experience and qualifications. We do our best to recruit and retain top physicians in the areas that they're going into. Centers of excellence in bariatrics we try to enhance that with the quality factors that we have and that we set forth in a lot of our agreements, and we continue to set forth quality in most of our agreements. Next slide, please. Oh, that was the last one. I was thinking there was another one on there. Then maybe I need to get my shaker going at this point.
And hey, Joel, this is Dave. We've got some questions from our live studio audience.
Sure.
So first question, how frequently should a compensation plan be updated? So I think I'll take that one. And there's the answer. So it depends. So factors that might come into play could include CMS fee schedule changes, changes in the marketplace, new program development, consolidation, mergers, and acquisitions that take place, changes in dynamics with health plans in the marketplace. So there's a whole host of variables that could prompt an organization. And at the end of the day, it needs to be sustainable to both parties. So next question is to Clay. The question is coming from South Dakota. How frequently should FMV analysis be updated?
Dave, what's the answer?
And again, look at this. It depends.
So from our perspective, it's pretty similar to industry standard. 3 years is kind of on the higher side, 2 years on the shorter side, but sometime in that time frame, barring a material change in facts and circumstances of the arrangement, but 2 to 3 years is what we see by our FMV reports for, as long as there's no, like I said, no material change. But after that, the data has definitely, the data typically changes year to year, somewhat significantly sometimes. But you get to that 2-3 year mark, you might want to revisit some of the FMV opinions you have for your providers.
Thanks, Blake. And the last question goes to Joel. It happens to be from Fresno, California. Who are the most important decision makers in the process for physician compensation and fair market value?
The most important ones. Dave, I've been taking notes for you. Oh, here you go. Let me help you out. Look, I took notes. I kind of copied off your notes. So it's always a pleasure to have those kind of questions. So the most important ones, it's all, from a hospital perspective, I think the most important ones in the decision-making process, obviously, are the operators, the administrators that are on the ground that are working with the physicians. Primarily, secondary to that is the physicians. It's important that they know and the hospital is comfortable with the services that they're providing. And probably thirdly to that is our legal. Obviously, anything that we do is set forth in a signed agreement with the physicians that's been through legal review. And fourthly is our compliance area, because that's big to us, right? I mean, every physician arrangement we write has to be compliant with the healthcare laws that are out there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So on behalf of Joel and Clay and myself, we thank everybody for their time today and enjoy the symposium. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.